Tokyo, capital of Japan. In this Japanese metropolis, skyscrapers, advertisements, and giant screens are the symbols of the power that the economy holds over society today. But 400 years ago, the power was in the hands of the samurai. And as a symbol of their power, these proud Japanese warriors built castles. Japanese castles are distinctive in that they are both massive strongholds with ingenious defensive features, as well as extraordinary structures with graceful architectural lines. An elegance that was directly inherited from the long Asiatic tradition of building temples. Discovering these castles is thus a way of better understanding Japan and its society caught between tradition and modernity. From the high walls of Kumamoto Castle to the elegant curved roofs of Hikone Castle, and including the last 12 original keeps, we invite you to explore the world of Japanese castles. Along a path under the shade of the sakura, the flowers of these ornamental cherry trees were, for the samurai, the symbol of the ephemeral beauty of life. Together, let us begin our discovery of these wooden giants with their stone foundations. Kinojo is a good example of the earliest castles. They were small, simple wooden forts surrounded by palisades. They were often only temporary structures that served both as watchtowers and as places of retreat in case of attack. At the end of the 15th century, the Sengoku period began. This marked the period of the warring provinces. Taking advantage of the collapse of central power, the local lords and clans clashed in what was to become the greatest civil war that Japan ever knew. The spread of the conflict created an increasing need for defensive structures. The small wooden forts were no longer adequate, so changes were made. As at Gifu, this new generation of castles often occupied higher ground. Here, the strategic objective was to control the commercial lands and water routes in central Japan. The local lord thus selected a hilltop and built a watchtower. The reconstruction of the keep in the last century was undertaken in the same spirit. The evolution of castles had begun. Civil war was still raging when the first Portuguese merchant ships arrived in Japan in 1543. Even if gunpowder and cannons were already known, their limited efficiency restricted their use in combat. So the Japanese were immediately interested by the quality of the European firearms. Through contact with Europeans, the Japanese gunsmiths improved their techniques, and firearms gradually appeared on the battlefields.
Up until the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Japan was divided into two clans, one in the east and one in the west. The arrival of firearms modified strategies and changed the situation.
The use of muskets and arquebuses eventually became generalized, and new strategies for combat became necessary. Castle architecture and the use of fortifications entered a new phase. The use of stone foundations and ramparts rapidly became the norm, as can be seen today in the ruins of Azuchi Castle. The fortress, begun in 1576, is considered today as the first modern Japanese castle. Its existence, however, was sadly brief. A mere 4 years after its completion, a fire destroyed the keep. Only the foundations survived. The castle was then abandoned. From the construction of Azuchi Castle in 1576 to the Battle of Osaka in 1615, Japanese castles were to experience their golden age. Kumamoto Castle was constructed in 1607. With its towering presence, it's one of the most impressive of these stone-footed wooden giants. It's also one of the rare sites where all of the characteristic military architectural elements of this period can be seen together. First of all, the moat. Next, the typically curved walls. It's said that the walls of Kumamoto Castle are so sheer that not even a mouse can climb them. Above the walls, the keep, of course. Today, a museum, the keep at Kumamoto was rebuilt in the 1960s. And finally, the Lord's Palace. Thanks to recent renovation, visitors can discover the richly decorated rooms where the Lord formerly held court. Seen from the paths below Kumamoto Castle, it's easy to understand the astonishment of the first Europeans who stood beneath these fortresses. At their apogee, Japanese castles successfully combined defensive features with architectural beauty to produce a unique result. In order to understand the reasons for this success, let's look at the organization of the sites in greater detail. We begin with the moat. These ditches, usually filled with water, were closely linked to the walls that they protected. They had a dual purpose. During building works, the material excavated from the ditch was used as a backfill necessary for the foundations that supported the walls. Once the castle was completed, the moats became important defensive structures which delimited the different walls and living areas of the site. Today, moats are often the first victims of urbanization. Usually, only the innermost moat surrounding the last rampart and the keep has survived. We also notice the presence of numerous sakura. Cherry blossoms were the emblem of the samurai, so perhaps there's a connection here. But the real reason might be a little less romantic. The strong roots of the trees play an important role in stabilizing the soil. A last detail. Whereas in Europe, moats are frequently associated with drawbridges, in Japan they were usually crossed by simple curved bridges that were painted red. The choice of this color is far from insignificant. Red is a sacred color in Japan. It marks the passage between the realms of the gods and that of men. Once we've crossed the bridge, we come to the defensive works formed by the ramparts and the gates. Marugame Castle on Shikoku Island. Even today, the high walls of this fortification are impressive. Typical of castle architecture, it is said that these walls have the shape of a fan. Yet the city of Marugame, famed for its fan production, has nothing to do with this. The analogy derives from their curved shape and the way they are positioned, one slightly above the other. A choice and an aesthetic primarily dictated by the need to cope with high seismic risks. A need that also imposed the technique of building without mortar. This is the only effective way to give the walls the necessary flexibility to resist earthquakes. Renowned for its fortifications, Marugame Castle is also famous for its keep. It's one of only 12 castles which still has its original timber structure. The keep retains the characteristic architectural features of the period. Curved gabled roofs, ceramic tiles, plaster walls, timber frame and structure, steep stairs, and finally, windows with large mullions. Ravaged by a fire in 1869, all that remains of the castle today are the keep and 2 gates, including the otemon, the main gate. Gates and ramparts are key defensive features. In most castles, entry is through a relatively large courtyard with compound gates set at right angles. This defensive element is called a masugata. The term, literally meaning a box, also describes the enclosure thus created. Attackers were particularly vulnerable here. Gates also served to flaunt the prestige of the castle and its lord.
This gate is called the Diamond Gate. It is one of the most important gates at Himeji Castle. Being the main gate, it is prestigious. When entering, you can see the Himeji Keep. This gate has 2 levels. The name of the Diamond Gate comes from the motifs seen on the mullions.
The doors were usually finely worked. The wrought iron not only reinforced them, but also offered a better defense against flaming arrows. And all without losing any of its elegance. Two other elements further strengthened the external defenses.
To defend the castle, there are machicolations, and the stairs leading to the keep are not rectilinear. The width of the steps is not uniform. The arrow slits in the walls are called sama. They serve for firearms or bows. Sama overlook the entrances.
Rectangular arrow slits were apparently preferred by archers. The circular sama were usually reserved for guns. Many ramparts are also equipped with timber frames upon which temporary flooring could be erected during an attack. While protecting the men using the slits below, it also served as a platform for additional marksmen above them. A very useful tactic when the defense had to be concentrated on a point of entry. As to defending its gates, we find a particularly interesting feature in Himeji Castle.
The wall behind me is called an oil wall. It's rather rare. When compared to other walls, you'll notice that it's not painted white. It's constructed of alternate layers of compacted sand and clay. This type of construction came from ancient China. This wall is only found here near the Hanami gate. If the enemy gets too close, then the wall is broken down. And this blocks the stairs. It's called a war wall.
Moats, gates and fortifications constitute a complex set of enclosures. At the center is the keep and the residence of the local lord, the daimyo.
People need certain things in their houses in order to live in them. First of all, they need water. But there's no provision for water in the keeps.
水ですね、水道というようなものはありません。
And there are no kitchens or dining rooms,
キッチン、台所というもの
nor are there any
ありません。
toilet
それ
facilities.
からトイレというものも
Keeps
あり
have
ません。
none of the amenities that are
つまりお
normally
城の
found in
中では
dwellings.
一般に人が生活をす
The
る
absence
という
of
こと
any such
も
amenities
できないような
suggests that it is not
そういう
really
生活
possible
の
to
ための
live
装置
inside
という
these
ものが
keeps.
つけられてないんですね。ですからお城の中で、
No one
生
lived
活
in
を
them.
していたということはありません。
Keeps were not inhabited. They were the ultimate defensive structure of a castle. The samurai were quartered in the outer enclosures. The daimyo resided at the foot of the tower. The lord's residence had all these amenities, including, of course, a kitchen. Palace architecture also aimed to provide most rooms with openings. Many gave onto magnificent interior gardens. Kochi Castle on Shikoku Island is one of the 12 castles which have retained their original wooden keep. It's also one of the rare castles where the innermost bailey, the Honmaru, is still intact. The palace from where the lord ruled over his domain is near the keep. At the center of the palace is the room where the lord held court. He sat upon a dais. The door to his right concealed armed samurai ready to intervene if necessary. Many of the original buildings at Kochi Castle no longer exist today. As at most other sites, they were destroyed after the restoration of the empire in 1868 as a result of the policy to erase the past that was instigated at the beginning of the Meiji period. About 60 kilometers from Kyoto, the ancient imperial capital, Hikone Castle was saved from destruction by order of the emperor himself. It's said that just after the promulgation of the law concerning the demolition of castles, the emperor visited the region and fell victim to its charm. Fortunately for Hikone, for today it has one of the last 12 original keeps. The construction of the castle began in 1603 and took nearly 20 years to complete. This can be explained by the numerous techniques employed and the immense works that were necessary for the fortifications. The keep at Hikone was in fact built by reutilizing elements from other castles. It was a frequent practice at the time for entire sections of buildings to be seized as plunder and to be integrated into newer constructions. The elegant keep, with its original wooden framework, its multiple gabled roofs, its white walls and its decorations, could almost make one forget that it is primarily a defensive structure.
On Hikone Castle, there is no hole out from outside, but if you can go inside, you can find rectangular or triangle holes. So when enemy attacks, we can use it break from inside and using gun or arrow.
Hikone Castle, however, remains an exceptional case. Elsewhere, the defensive architectural elements of the buildings, such as Yagura, the watchtowers, and Tenshu, the keeps, are clearly more visible. Large mullioned windows, arrow slits piercing the walls, and trapdoors overhanging the foundations are all key elements of this military architecture.
In addition to the sama, the arrow slits of the castles, mullioned windows also protected the marksmen. And if the enemy tried to scale the ramparts, the trapdoors were then used to pour boiling water or drop stones on them.
This outline of Japanese castle design would not be complete without a word about watchtowers, and in particular the Taiko Yagura, the drum tower. It occupied an important place in the castle. The drum served both to sound the time for daily life as well as to signal in case of attack. Matsue, Shimane Prefecture, the western coast of Honshu Island. The Yagura which dominate the castle moats today are reconstructions of the original towers. Easier and cheaper to demolish, these buildings were the first structures to go after the restoration of the empire in 1868. Only the keep managed to escape this fatal doom. Today, it's one of the 12 remaining original keeps left in Japan. Matsue Castle also has one of the rare black keeps, a color which today raises certain questions. The most common reason given for this is that, in order to deal with the local climate, the walls were not covered with plaster but with varnished wood instead. The interior of the keep has a singular defensive particularity. The stairs can be completely dismantled. Any of the 6 floors of the tower can be completely isolated from the others. Today, the keep's interior has been transformed into a magnificent museum, largely dedicated to local samurai. An ultimate defense, more esoteric this time, is perched on top of the Tenshu and the Yagura, the Shachihoko.
The Shachihoko is a mythical animal of Japanese folklore. It has the head of a tiger and the body of a carp. It's used as a talisman, as protection against fire. But it is also a very common decoration on many castles.
Of all the defensive measures taken, the Shachihoko was certainly the least effective. Mistreated by history and desecrated by natural catastrophes, many Japanese castles are now long gone. In their heyday at the beginning of the 17th century, there were more than 1,000 feudal domains in Japan. Today, only 250 castles remain, and only about 100 receive proper attention in terms of maintenance. Many former castle sites, such as at Morioka, have been transformed into parks. Only a few stone walls or stairways testify today to these former strongholds. Or perhaps even a small red bridge spanning an old moat. Located in the city centre, this park was partly re-landscaped in the 20th century. Regardless of the season, it is regularly used by city dwellers. The siege of Osaka Castle in 1615 marked the beginning of the end for Japanese castles. The country was united. Castles and samurai henceforth assumed a more political than military role. The ruins of Takato Castle. The unifying bond between castles, samurai and cherry trees is at its strongest here. During the few days of their full bloom, a huge crowd comes to celebrate Hanami. This custom, in which the contemplation of the flowers becomes a hymn to life, has been celebrated everywhere in Japan for over 12 centuries. Initially only celebrated by the imperial court, Hanami later spread to the samurai class. The image of this flower that does not wilt, but is torn off by the wind in full bloom, then became their emblem. At Takato, in homage to those fallen in past battles, when the castle was demolished, hundreds of sakura were planted. Cherry trees whose flowers, it is said, have a slightly red hue by virtue of the blood that has bathed their roots. Here, the desire to perpetuate the memory and the history of the samurai is such that cutting the trees is forbidden. Elsewhere, it is this pride and the desire to preserve the past that has led to the renovation of the castles. The 1930s and the crisis that shook the world inflamed in Japan a revived sense of national pride. This revival was a boon to the castles which had up until then often been abandoned. It was at this time that the attempt to restore Bichu Matsuyama began.
In 1870, the Meiji era began. A law to demolish all the castles in the country was written. The order arrived here in 1873. So the bottom of the castle was destroyed. But the cost for demolishing the keep situated in the mountains was too high. So the castle was abandoned. Undergrowth and termites took over. The city of Takahashi is at the foot of the castle. Its inhabitants decided in 1926 to rebuild it. So the whole population swung into action. The major part of the renovations took place at that time. But works were not only restricted to that period. They were to continue until the Heisei era in 1989, by which time the repairs were completely finished.
By renovating the site, the inhabitants made the castle of Bichu Matsuyama the only mountain castle that was part of the 12 so-called original castles. The people's pride in their local heritage was a key element in carrying out the enormous work that was required. Here also, the determination of the local population to save their castle was crucial. In 1948, the Fukui earthquake almost entirely destroyed the keep. The restoration was carried out at that time using more than 80% of the original materials saved from the rubble. This recuperation work, notably for the beams, today places the keep as part of the closed circle of the 12 original keeps. It's the oldest Japanese keep and can also boast a special architectural feature. It's the only keep to have stone tiles rather than ceramic ones. The keep is here constructed in the style of a watchtower, with its balcony going all the way around the upper level. The interior is classical in wood, but nonetheless stands out because of its stairs. Their steep incline makes them closer to stairs in Yagura than to stairs in Tenshus. Some renovations were dictated by necessity, like at Maruoka, but others were duly planned. That was the case with Matsumoto Castle, where once again the population helped to preserve the site.
また、古城会の皆さんもこのお城の
Every
行事に
year, the people
協
of
力していただ
Matsumoto
いたり、
clean the
それから
gardens.
市民の方が落ち葉掃きをしてくださったりと。
It's quite a
いろんな
large
皆さんが
gathering,
常にこのお城を守るということで、
and everyone works together.
いうことは市民にとってこのお城はかけがえのないも
They
のである
sweep
ということを
and gather up the
物語
dead
っていると思い
leaves.
ます。こういった市民にとって素晴らしい松本城をこれからも
The
ずっと
citizens
守って
are
いきた
very
い
attached
と
to
い
their
うふう
castle.
に誰もが思っております。
An attachment largely visible also in all the events organized around the site. Regular maintenance doesn't rule out the need for more serious works. After 5 years of restoration work, the keep of Himeji Castle, jewel of Japanese castles with its high, elegant forms, deserves more than ever the nickname Castle of the White Heron. Classed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it is in fact a true object of veneration in Japan. Its complex system of doors and walls that are all integrated form a real labyrinth defended by more than 2,000 sama. Here the art of fortifications and defensive engineering has attained its apex. Himeji is primarily through its architecture and its beauty the archetype of Japanese castles at their height. Of the 12 castles said to be the originals, Himeji is certainly the most imposing. The long corridors that run through it and that offer a covered passage between the different towers are, for that matter, unique in Japan. The visit to the keep is made in a subdued fashion, imposed by the martial atmosphere of the monument. On the walls and under the windows are found musket supports. The structure rests on 2 huge pillars, of which one dates from the castle's construction. Once you've climbed the keep's 6 floors, a surprise is waiting for you. A little sanctuary. Quite unique in a castle. It's also the castle with the most buildings intact. This exceptional state of conservation is largely due to a strict policy of upkeep, with every 50 years, a program of renovations spread over 5 years. The magnificence of the castle, the impression of power that it conveys, as well as its historic significance, contribute to the aura surrounding it, an aura deepened today by the impact of the last great restoration of the keep. Situated on the west coast of the island of Shikoku, Uwajima Castle benefited from the great post-war wave of restoration. Abandoned in the early years of the Meiji era, then damaged in the bombings during the Second World War, the keep was entirely restored, saving the structure of its original timber frame. It is therefore part of the 12 original keeps. The elegance of the structure is directly linked to its double function. It also served as a reception hall for the daimyo. The interior clearly reflects this double usage. The layout of the first two levels, with the presence of the sliding panels, allowed for the demarcation of different areas. In the center were areas reserved for the Lord. In those days, this area for giving audiences most probably had its floor covered with tatamis. The corridor surrounding it that overlooks the exterior was the area reserved for the defenders of the site. Even though it was abandoned in 1871, Uwajima Castle had previously experienced relative political stability. This doubtlessly explains why it was able to survive centuries without undergoing irreparable damage. Not all of the sites were this lucky. Takeda is one of the abandoned castles in which today all that remains is an impressive field of ruins.
The walls from the period of the fighting provinces are very well preserved. They could be called the Machu Picchu of the East, or the Machu Picchu of Japan. In fact, we actually have exchanges with the Machu Picchu site in Peru.
A series of photos from the beginning of the years 2000 and a comparison with the Machu Picchu site have allowed the general public to discover the ruins of the castle. It was the seppuku ritual suicide of its daimyo in 1600 that marks the beginning of the slow, inexorable deterioration of the castle's structures. Today, the reputation of and attendance to the site are constantly increasing. A craze that is not without problems and forces the municipality to restrict access to the site so as to limit its deterioration. We find here the typical architecture of mountain fortresses, with numerous platforms carved into the rock. Nature afforded high, sheer walls used for defense purposes, on which the buildings were constructed.
The ruins have not been modified. They are the symbol of the city. The site has a great future in tourism. But with so many visits to the castle, we have to think about protecting the ruins.
This disposition to promote heritage is also the driving force behind some ambitious projects.
In Japan, the four castles that are considered national treasures are Matsumoto Castle, Himeji Castle, Ikone Castle, and Inuyama Castle. Study groups are at work at this time to get them all classed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites.
In the spring of 2015, Matsue Castle was also classified a national treasure. Hirozaki Castle in the north of Honshu Island is also well and truly looking towards the future. The days when its moat was a means of defense are only a far-off memory. The site, whose spring festival of the sakura blossoming is one of the most important in Japan, welcomes more than 200,000 visitors a year. By the end of the morning, the site is filling up, and groups gather on huge blue tarpaulins. During the few record busiest days, the imperative is being able to eat beneath the Tenshu's windows. Destroyed by a fire, the keep was later rebuilt at the beginning of the 19th century. It is, however, still one of the 12 originals because it was entirely constructed on a timber frame. For a few days, the castle park turns into a huge picnic area. Then you see stalls spring up where everyone can find his favorite snack for the occasion. You can buy a variety of grilled fish, vegetable pancakes called okonomiyaki, or bananas topped with chocolate. Once you've done your shopping, all you have to do is find a spot in the shade of the flowering cherry trees and enjoy your food. Apart from its commercial and festive aspect, Hanami is above all a great moment of artistic and musical freedom. As night falls, the lights transform Himeji Castle, and the keep becomes the center of the cyclopean photographer's eye. This ongoing commitment to enhance its heritage has led the town of Hirosaki to develop a series of events connected to the seasons. Autumn becomes the time to light up the moat, and in so doing, emphasizes the many shades of red seen in the maple trees. It's a surprising and somewhat irreal scene that strollers enjoy. All that's needed is a few flakes and the scene becomes magical. The snow gives a whole new face to the castle, and the keep seems to be wearing a brand new, spotless kimono. Matsumoto Castle also adorns itself in lights for the spring festivities.
A variety of events are held at the castle. In spring, it's Sakura time, and there are light shows at night. In autumn, it's the time of Kojo Matsuri. The castle festivities always end very late. There are exhibitions and concerts. There are also tea ceremonies and tastings.
For 2 nights, the site is open to all. For night owls, it's a chance to discover the castle in another light. An opportunity for children and adults to indulge in their favorite sport of the moment, photographing the sakura blossom. At first sight, the keep of Matsumoto Castle is impressive. A fortress standing at the foot of the Japanese Alps, the castle, constructed in the last years of the 16th century, fulfilled the double purpose of ensuring defense and establishing the authority of the daimyo. Over time, the keep, little by little, became the symbol of the city. In this way, it escaped destruction at the beginning of the Meiji era, having been purchased from the state by the population. Inside, polished by time, Floors and beams offer visitors a whole range of woody tones, from deep brown to golden cork. The higher up you go, the thinner are the walls, for the simple reason that enemy fire was less efficient at a height. Going from one display to the next, the visitor gradually discovers the history of the castle, along a journey that sometimes seems like a labyrinth. At Matsumoto, as in the rest of the country, full bloom and the Hanami festivities mark the beginning of the summer tourist season. With an ever-increasing number of visitors, the castles have adapted to their new role. By assuming the part of historical and cultural showcase, they have found their place in the great tourist marketplace. A reconversion that, more than 400 years after their golden age, plunges them into the middle of new battles, this time economic ones. The sabres of yesteryear have given way to much less dangerous replicas, and for a couple of hundred yen you can leave with a souvenir. The castles count mainly on their beauty and their history to attract the public. They also make use of the strong symbolic value of the samurai himself. A central figure in Japanese history, he fascinates both young and old alike. And once again, everything is done for the visitor to leave with his souvenir photo. Mons, those family emblems that were once distinctive signs on the fields of battle, have today become, as in Matsuyama, visual marketing tools. Matsuyama Castle ranks among the most beautiful in Japan. Like many others, it almost disappeared at the beginning of the Meiji era. Purchased by the city, then partially destroyed in the Second World War, it benefited from the momentum of the 1960s supporting national heritage to start a first series of restorations. The site, with that of Himeji and Matsumoto, is one of the most beautiful in terms of conservation of its original structures. It is also, with its many sakura, renowned for celebrating Hanami. In the tourist battle, the castles also benefit from a tool that's very popular in Japan. That's their mascots. These emblematic characters act as ambassadors to promote the sites. Some of them, like Hikonyan, have become real stars.
Name it Hikonyan, and he became a very popular character in Japan. So nowadays, all over Japan, many people to meet Hikonyan comes to Himeji Castle. Hi.
A celebrity going hand in glove with merchandising where everything is possible. From granite statues to the inevitable charms for portable phones, the only limit is the imagination. A little helmeted cat in Hikone. In Inuyama, the mascot is a samurai dog. It's a logical choice since the name literally means the mountain of the dogs. Inuyama Castle is also famous for its keep, overlooking the waters of the Kiso River. The image is, for that matter, today widely associated with that typical of a mountain castle. It was built using the style of a watchtower, an atypical architecture at the time of its foundation in 1601. You find inside long, steep staircases. Climbing them is sometimes a balancing act. For the visitor, the reward is at the top, when he can finally walk along the exterior passageway and admire the view of the valley. Today, managed by the city, It's the only one of all the castles that remained private property until the beginning of the 2000s. Included among the 12 original castles, its popularity attains record heights every first weekend of April at the springtime Matsuri. This traditional festival celebrates the protective spirit of the city. For 2 days, the streets are packed. Passers-by and walkers amble between stalls as they wait for the parades which night and day bring the town to life. The traces that the Bushido, the way of the warrior, has left in the collective unconscious of the Japanese people certainly explains, in part, its interest in and commitment to the preservation of the castles. Historic heritage and reflections of the virtues of honor and pride associated with the samurai, the castles are today both guardians of tradition and economic assets, a double role in the image of Japanese society.